I've always loved trees and working with wood as an architect, but I've also learnt that it can be the very best or the very worst material we can use to build with, and that depends on where and how it's sourced. And that's certainly the case in the context of these crises or this climate and biodiversity emergency, these twin emergency that we have. The most optimistic climate scientists are desperately trying to tell us that if we want to avoid broad social and economic collapse later this century, we've got at best till 2050, so that's only 26 years, to reach net zero emissions. And we also need to be well on the way by then with deep atmospheric carbon drawdown, for which, in significant part, we'll be leaning heavily on healthy forests. I'm actually concerned that the discourse in Working Group 5F, when I've been joining in, and also in the previous sort of iterations of this group, it's focused on the aim of advancing the story that because it grows on trees that lock up CO2 from our ailing atmosphere, all wood is good. It's the ultimate renewable, and the more of it we use in our builds, the better for our climate. And this crowds out discussion and exploration of much better ways forward beyond business as usual in forest management, in timber product manufacture, and in building design. So rigour with which I think MECLA can really make a difference in this emergency. So MECLA is on about counting carbon from cradle to grave. And for that purpose, we've got environmental product declarations, and they inform life cycle assessments. Now, EPDs for Australian timber products address only the middle part of this life cycle. They count the carbon that's stored in the constructed timber element, so through its service life. So the biogenic global, what I prefer to call the global cooling potential, or in this table it's called GWPB, or global warming potential biogenic. They subtract from that fossil fuel emissions attached to timber procurement, so timber from the log landing at the forest edge, through the sawmill and other processing plant, to packaging and transport to the wholesaler or the retailer. So these are fossil fuel related global warming potential, or GWPF. And that counting, it suggests that there's a net carbon positive footprint, or if you like, a net global cooling potential attached to most timber products that we use. So this is counting the middle bit of the equation, but not the cradle or the grave. The cradle lies in the forest. The density of stored carbon and biodiversity, it doesn't get better than what we've got in our tall, wet ash forests, not far from where I live in Victoria. And they're the source of those hardwood species like mountain ash and alpine ash that are probably the most used native species in builds across Australia. I've roughed up an image here of indicative amounts of above ground carbon stored in forests of the world from which we source our construction timber for Australian builds. These figures, they're indicative amalgams that are taken from respected research papers authored by both sides of the forest debate. So it shows your ash regrowth from up in there in the Central Highlands of Victoria. Their regrowth from the 1939 bushfires. So around the 600, we'll give or take quite a bit, but around that 600 tonnes per hectare of above ground carbon. A healthy Victorian radiata pine plantation storing about a third of the carbon of a tall native ash forest. In the Northern Hemisphere, in those cold parts, the northern boreal or spruce forests being where most CLT and roughly 40% of stick framing that goes into our builds in Australia currently comes from. and tropical rainforest being where the urbu of our great Aussie decks comes from. Now, timber harvesting of native forest across Victoria, Tasmania, southern New South Wales, as well as of WA's Karri forests, that occurs mostly and essentially as clear fell. You can look at government statistics from ABARES or from DECA, and you can simply observe logging operations on the ground, and it'll show that roughly 50% of the stored carbon in these forests is left on site. It's pushed into windrows and it's burnt. Now, the figures in this flow chart, they vary quite a bit, depending on the age, the health, the disturbance, the management history of the forest from which the saw logs are sourced. And of course, also the efficiency and the breadth of product coming from wood processing plants that are fed by the forest harvest. So you can see at the top there, from the carbon in the forest, after a clear fell logging operation, roughly half of it is either burnt immediately, the slash and all the debris from the last photo, and there is some charred remains, and they may take a smaller or a longer period of time to decompose, depending on a range of factors around that charred carbon. And the other 50% of that carbon that's harvested in clear fell will leave the site in log form. And from walking with senior Vic Forest people who've candidly explained to me on site, a number of them over a number of years, wandering through that, the amount of that log that leaves the site that actually finds its way to a green sawmill for timber milling, for construction, it could be anything from 50% right down to 0%, depending on how that operation actually goes and the quality of what comes out of it. At the sawmill, the recovery of sawn wood from the log, again, varies enormously. It can be from 50% in some very efficient mills like Australian Sustainable Hardwoods, can be right down to 20%, depending also on the quality of the log that comes to the mill and the efficiency of the mill. And then from there, of course, the green board, that needs to be kiln dried, it needs to be thicknessed, and it needs to be profiled to the product that's going to go to the building site, floorboard, cladding, whatever. On the building site, there's an amount of waste as well. Hopefully not so much if you've got a smart builder and good carpenters, but only a small proportion of the forest carbon it actually finds its way to the building site and into our builds. There's no question about that. So with our timber in our designs, we architects and engineers, we're affecting an upfront carbon debt at the cradle in the forest as a loss of stored carbon and as an interruption to atmospheric CO2 sequestration going forward that very much dwarfs any carbon that's stored in our builds. And EPDs don't account for this overwhelming debt. Now, we could argue, as our EPDs, our Australian EPDs do, and also EPDs from other countries, that in the 30 to 90 years time, depending on the forest type and the management between harvest cycles, this cradle carbon will have fully replenished itself in a regenerated forest. That's the assumption. So what's the big deal? The crucial question is, what are the global carbon and climate ramifications attached to our timber specifications today and on the 26 years that we've got left to make a real difference? The photo on the left is a site from the Central Highlands, sort of West Gippsland, a post-harvest, towards the end of a post-harvest burn and the soil scarification that takes place. And you can see there's virtually no above ground carbon left at all. The photos on the right, or the one on the right, in the middle ground, you can see in the clear fell, there are some seed retention trees retained, or habitat trees, but they are commonly killed in the post-harvest burn in the year after the logging. And if not, they often succumb to the much greater level of exposure that they're facing and they're not used to without mates around them. In the foreground and the background, you've got congested, single-aged, maybe 10 to 25-year-old regrowth that's desperately competing for light. It's very dense, desperately competing for light, water, and nutrient resources. It's a forest system that's poorly adapted to survive drought and heat-related decline, and of course also wildfire. These are impacts that are continually exacerbated by our changing climate, and it leads to further consequent negative carbon and biodiversity outcomes. Now, it's not clearfell logging per se, but rather its vast scale and intensity across the landscape as it occurs for the most under business as usual that diminishes the wildfire survival, biodiversity, water flows, soil health, and CO2 sequestration capacity of a subsequently regenerating natural forest in a rapidly changing climate. Now, these graphs very roughly plot the dynamic net carbon balance that's attached to cyclical clearfell harvest today of a Victorian native ash forest and, as another example, a southern New South Wales pine plantation. Across the fading time frame, so that's the green fade on the graphs, fading time frame that we've actually got remaining for impactful atmospheric CO2 drawdown. The indicative net carbon balance it accounts that you've got here, it accounts for, you can see on the left side, it probably takes a bit more time to study, but the carbon emissions it has there that are with the post-harvest slash burning and decay, the burning of wood waste in timber production, as well as aerobic decay of timber and paper products. It includes the carbon sequestered post-harvest in forest regrowth. For pine plantations, it shows the carbon emissions and the sequestration in mid-cycle plantation thinnings, so to slash, to paper and fibreboard products. And it accounts for the carbon that's stored in timber and paper products. The little green lines here, the little brown line and the little blue lines, the pulp, that's the paper pulse, and then the timber, long-lived timber product that's coming is then from the mill. From the forest. Now they do show all of these graphs how clear-cut harvest of both native ash and plantation pine forests in southern Australia, it affects an immediate and an overwhelming loss of forest carbon. You can see that in the pulse down immediately after the harvest. It's much greater than the gain in the carbon that's then stored in the timber and the paper products. So there's those pulses in blue and brown on the left. The graphs also show how fast rotation plantation forestry with a production cycle around the 35-year mark, yielding much more long-lived sawlog and less short-lived forest slash and pulp log than native forestry, that more rapidly repays what's an initially lower upfront net carbon debt via its regrowth. And that's in part because laminated veneer lumber, LVL and plywood, they can be rotary peeled from small diameter forest thinnings, while board products like particle board and fibreboard, they can be of reconstituted wood fibre, also from thinnings, lower grade logs, the tops of trees, sawmill and building demolition wood waste. Now for the most, these manufactured timber products are sourced from softwood fibre, but hardwood can be of equal value here. The graph on the right highlights how the net carbon debt, or the true global carbon footprint of timber locked into builds today, it's not fixed as EPDs suggest, but rather it's dynamic over time. And you can see that the net carbon debt that's attached to timber from short cycle plantation clear fell can be fully repaid within the time frame we've got remaining for impactful carbon drawdown these next 26 years, or 20, 30, 40 years, whatever you want to call it. Whereas that attached to timber from long cycle native forest clear fell, so around your 70 years, it can't. Be mindful that these graphs also don't account for the increased impacts that wildfire, heat and drought-related stresses are already having on forests. And these are impacts that will increasingly reduce the rate of carbon sequestration in post-harvest regrowth of both native forests and plantations to below the historical levels that we lean on and rely on without the figures that we put out. I'm acutely aware that these graphs represent a myopic southern state view of things, and that selection harvesting up in Clarissa's part of the world are more prevalent. They're more prevalent in northern New South Wales, Queensland and WA's Jarrah forests. And it affects a very different carbon dynamic that's hugely dependent, however, on the intensity of that harvesting and whether it's based on high grading or genuine ecological thinning. Now, the latter of those, genuine ecological thinning, that is a science in itself with broader benefits for forest health and biodiversity. The figures informing these graphs, they're always highly contested. So I've drawn on a balance of key publications and lectures and websites from, amongst others, ABARES, DELP in Victoria, that's now DECA, Australian Forest Products Association, Forest Wood Products Australia, Forest Scientists in Melbourne, ANU, Griffith Universities, Gippsland Forestry Hub, BAE Economics, Principal Economics. So here are indicative emissions footprints for various wall cladding products, for example, when we account also for the dynamic carbon debt incurred at the cradle. So that's in the land system from which these biogenic materials are sourced over the critical years that we've got ahead for climate action in this emergency. So I've mapped it to 2050. Building materials from biological sources affect global carbon footprints that are dynamic over time, and they're centred on the biosystems from which they're harvested. Materials from mineral sources, so, steel and brick, those sorts of materials, on the other hand, they affect mostly lesser upfront, but irreversible carbon footprints. They're not as dynamic at all. I appreciate that much of MECLA's good work would not be possible without generous sponsorship from materials and construction industry. But that said, I would love to see Working Group 5F more critically review its industry-centred and largely business-as-usual discourse around trees, wood and architecture in a climate emergency. I'd like to see it investigate without commercial bias what the most carbon-friendly and biologically restorative systems of active forest management might look like, and to identify what, if any, wood fibre could be drawn from such silviculture centred on healthy forests or keeping healthy forests. And then to advocate timber product manufacturing that draws efficiently on this genuine good wood. And that then equips MECLA followers, so building professionals like me, to preference better timber product development and commercialisation. And we can do that through our material specifications and our design detailing. So, for example, preferencing timber that's sourced locally from fast-grown plantations. We can, as architects, we can incentivise family farmers to plant and smartly manage more trees, both for nature conservation and for high-value soil production, on the vast acreage of bare land that they've found to be unsuitable for other agricultural use. So our job then is to preference and celebrate these timber products that affect much less forest carbon debt and other ecological burden on our kids, our grandkids, and the natural world that'll otherwise really struggle to sustain them. So here we've got, on this slide, we've got high value glulam from super fast grown plantation shining gum. So, from 15 to 25 years of age, that'd otherwise be destined for pulp production. So by cusp and by ash. And here we've got parallel strand lumber from very young tree thinnings. It's a technology for which our CSIRO, it developed it in the 1980s, but then sold it to America for onward commercialisation there and through some Southeast Australian countries. Some of that PSL is finding its way back into Australia now as an import. I appreciate arguments made that over the next decades, we won't have anywhere near enough wood here to meet local demand, and that we'll need to import more and more from overseas, and much of it will be from questionable environmental chains of custody. It's a legacy of miserable short-term thinking and decisions made locally by big timber business and governments alike. Resource insecurity in an ailing natural world will inevitably now drive bigger shifts in government policy and community aspiration around urgent reforestation of our bare Australian landscapes. And these shifts will also have us architects designing smaller, demonstrating with an urgent passion how small can be beautiful, how it can also avoid our clients overstretching their finances and allow for other joys and challenges ahead. If our clients have got cash to splash, their environmental and social responsibility will have them rather invest in quality that supports fine craftsmanship rather than quantity that draws so heavily on our planet's finite natural resources. Because if we can design durable and flexible and lean, we can make the most of these limited material resources, including timber, and we can build enduring beauty with long life, multifunctional and intensive use. Relentless forest wars, they have borne no winners in this emergency. And sadly, we're at a point with climate change where our trees in both production and conservation tenures won't be saved without active forest health-centred silviculture. We urgently need to come together with a can-do spirit, and we need to freely and feverishly share our smarts and our passions across all camps and disciplines towards rebuilding community and re-loving the earth. And established in 2021, this Gippsland Forest Dialogue that I'm involved in and the many people are involved in, it's an example of an awesome step in that direction. I'll include a narrated PowerPoint of this presentation on my website under Things to Share, where there's a page titled Trees, Wood and Architecture. And it also contains plenty of guides and YouTubes related to all this stuff. Thanks everyone for hanging in there through what I appreciate. It's a perspective that will raise concern for some people, but thank you.